We begin, as
You
we
must
always must, with the
understand.
truth of it, plain and
I
unadorned.
can't
At
let them
47
take
years old,
it.
Eleanor
I know.
Whitfield had nothing
I'll
left to
make
her
sure
name
they
but the
don't.
clothes on her back, a satchel of her late husband's tools, and $11 folded twice inside her glove. It was her husband's own brother, Cyrus Whitfield, who had cast her out,
Keep 'em
declaring
steady
before the
just a
whole of
little
Millhaven
further.
Creek, Kansas, that the farm she and Thomas had built from raw prairie
Almost
sod
there.
belonged now to him. On account of debts he swore Thomas owed him, debts no one but Cyrus had ever seen written down. And so, in the dry, bone-colored autumn of 1888, with the wheat failed and the creek running thin as a whisper, Eleanor Whitfield walked into town with almost nothing and did the only foolish, desperate thing left to a woman in her position. She spent 9 of her $11 on an abandoned bakery no one else in town would touch, a crooked little building with a caved porch and a door the last owner had nailed shut before he died. The old women of Millhaven Creek clutched their shawls and told her not to open that door beneath the oven. They said the bakery was cursed, that its dead baker had sealed something down there that ought never see daylight again. But beneath that oven, sealed away in darkness, slept a promise time itself could not break. A promise that would not only save Eleanor Whitfield's life, but would reach back across 9 hard years and set right a wrong that had been quietly strangling the whole of that town. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Whitfield. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, someplace others have already written off, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We would love to know you're there. Eleanor in Prescott had been raised, from the time she could reach the flour bin, in her mother's bakery in Council Bluffs, Iowa, in a kitchen that smelled always of scorched sugar and rising dough. And it was there, at her mother Margaret's elbow, that she learned the 2 things that would carry her through every hardship life would later hand her. That bread rewarded patience and would not be rushed by an impatient hand, and that a person's worth was never measured by what they owned, but by what they were willing to give away when they had almost nothing. Margaret Prescott had been a widow herself, raising Eleanor alone after a fever took her father when Eleanor was only 6, and she had done it by baking bread for the whole of that river town. Bread for the wealthy merchants on the hill and bread, quietly, for free, wrapped in cloth and left on the doorsteps of families who could not pay, families whose pride Margaret was careful never to wound. Eleanor grew up believing this was simply what a bakery was for, that flour and yeast and fire were a kind of ministry, and she carried this belief with her the way other young women carried hope chests, folded and ready for the day she would need it. She met Thomas Whitfield when she was 22, a quiet, broad-shouldered young man from Kansas who had come through Council Bluffs buying seed corn, and who lingered 3 extra days in town for reasons he later admitted had nothing to do with corn at all. Thomas was gentle in the particular way of men who have spent their whole lives working land that does not always love them back. And when he asked Eleanor to come west with him to Millhaven Creek, she went without a single backward glance, though her mother wept at the parting and pressed a small tin of her own sourdough starter into Eleanor's hands, telling her, "Keep this alive, and you will never be entirely without a home." Eleanor kept it alive for 22 years. In Millhaven Creek, Thomas and Eleanor built a farm together on land that was hard but honest, and though children never came to them, they filled the house instead with the rhythms of the seasons, planting, haying, the slow gold turn of wheat, and always in Eleanor's kitchen, the low, breathing warmth of bread rising under a cloth. She became known, in her quiet way, for the same generosity her mother had practiced. A loaf left on the Kowalski family's step the winter their well went bad. A basket of rolls sent to the Ostrander children the year their father broke his leg in the thresher. Thomas used to tease her that she would bankrupt them both with kindness, but he never once asked her to stop. And in the town's collective memory, Eleanor Whitfield's name became braided together with the smell of good bread and the sense, however faint, that someone in Millhaven Creek was always watching out for the ones who slipped through the cracks. It was Thomas's younger brother, Cyrus, who watched all this with a different eye entirely. Cyrus had left Millhaven Creek as a young man to make his fortune in banking and land speculation in Topeka, and he returned some years later a changed man, sharper in his suits and sharper in his dealings. buying up mortgages on failing farms throughout the county at prices so favorable to himself that the county recorder, a nervous man named Elias Bragg, would not meet the eyes of the farmers whose names he entered into foreclosure. Thomas never trusted his brother's new fortune, and said so plainly at the supper table more than once, which Eleanor would later understand had cost her more than she ever knew at the time. Thomas Whitfield was a careful man who kept his own ledgers close, distrustful of banks in general and his brother in particular. It was this same carefulness, this same quiet unwillingness to hand his affairs to another man's keeping, that would matter more than anyone in Millhaven Creek yet understood. The drought came in 1886 and did not properly break for 3 years, and it took first the Whitfields' wheat, then their cattle, then in the bitter February of 1888, it took Thomas himself. Carried off by a lung fever, he caught working cattle in a late, freezing rain he should have had the sense to come in from. Eleanor buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the dry creek bed that had given the town its now bitter name, and she had scarcely finished planting grass over his grave when Cyrus Whitfield arrived at her door with a lawyer from Topeka and a stack of papers bearing Thomas's signature, papers that showed the farm mortgage twice over to Cyrus himself, with debts Eleanor had never once heard her careful husband mention. She asked to see Thomas's own ledgers, the ones he kept locked in his roll-top desk, and found the desk already emptied, the ledgers gone, and Cyrus's face arranged into an expression of practiced sorrow as he explained that he had taken the liberty of removing his brother's papers for safekeeping during her grief. The county judge, a tired man near retirement who owed his own modest comforts to a loan from Cyrus's bank, signed the foreclosure without more than a cursory glance, and within 6 weeks of burying her husband, Eleanor Whitfield stood on the road outside the only home she had known in 22 years, holding a single trunk of clothing, her mother's tin of sourdough starter wrapped in a shawl against her chest, and $11 that represented the entire remaining fortune of a woman who, 1 season earlier, had never once gone hungry. She did not weep in front of Cyrus, though it cost her everything she had left not to. She had learned that much from her mother, too, that some griefs were not to be spent as currency in front of those who had caused them. She walked the 4 miles into Millhaven Creek proper with her trunk borrowed onto old Ferris Kowalski's wagon, the same family whose well had gone bad all those years ago, and Ferris's wife Anna took one look at Eleanor's face and did not ask a single question, only fed her supper and gave her a bed in the loft for as long as she needed it, which Eleanor accepted with the particular shame of a woman used to giving, not receiving. It was Anna Kowalski, 3 days later, who first mentioned the old Larkspur bakery, empty now these 9 years since its owner, a strange, silent Danish immigrant named Josiah Kestrel, had died alone in the back room with no kin anyone could find and anyone could locate, leaving the little building to sit boarded up and sinking slowly into the prairie earth on the edge of town, its oven cold, its door nailed fast, while the town's children dared each other to run up and touch its porch, and run away again before anything inside could catch them. The county's been trying to sell it off for taxes for years, Anna said, but nobody'll touch it. They say old Kestrel sealed something down in that cellar before he died, and folks around here have got a superstitious streak wider than the Kansas sky. Eleanor, who had precisely $11 and precisely nowhere else in the world to put herself, asked when the county's next tax sale might be. The sale was held on a Saturday morning in the county courthouse, a squat limestone building that smelled of dust and old paper, and Eleanor Whitfield was the only bidder who raised her hand when the auctioneer, a bored young clerk named Nathaniel Ferris, called out the Larkspur bakery parcel. $9, he said, was the minimum the county required to clear the back taxes, and when no other voice answered his call, he brought his little gavel down and pronounced the property hers with the flat indifference of a man selling off a dead mule. Eleanor Whitfield walked out of that courthouse the owner of a crumbling, boarded-up bakery on the wrong end of a dying town, with $2 left in her glove and the distinct, sinking sense that she had just done something both desperate and profoundly foolish. Old Henrietta Bragg, the recorder's mother and the keeper of every piece of gossip Millhaven Creek had accumulated in 50 years, caught Eleanor's sleeve on the courthouse steps and told her, in a hushed voice reserved for matters of real consequence, "You mark me, girl. Don't you go opening that cellar door under the oven. Josiah Kestrel nailed it, shut himself the winter before he died, and he told my late husband it was to stay shut forever, that some things weren't meant for this town to have. There's people around here believe he cursed it. Eleanor, who had buried a husband and lost a farm and had precisely $2 left to her name, found she was not much afraid of curses that winter. She thanked Henrietta for her concern, took the iron key from Nathaniel Ferris's outstretched hand, and walked the half-mile to the edge of town to see, for the first time in her life, the only home left to her in all the world. The bakery, when she reached it, looked smaller and sadder than even its reputation had promised, a single-story frame building with a false front gone silver gray with weather, its windows boarded, its porch sagging at one corner where the footing had shifted, prairie grass grown up thick and gold around its foundation, as though the earth itself were trying gently to reclaim it. Eleanor pried the boards from the front door with a crowbar borrowed from Ferris Kowalski, and when she stepped inside, dust rose around her ankles like something disturbed from a long sleep, and she stood a long moment in the gray afternoon light, filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, looking at what 9 years of abandonment had left behind. There was a long wooden counter, warped but sound, cobweb shelves that had once held loaves for sale, and against the back wall, dominating the small room the way a church dominates a town square, stood the great brick oven itself, cold and silent, its iron door hanging slightly open as though the last loaf had been pulled from it only that morning instead of nearly a decade before. Eleanor ran her hand along the oven's brick face, feeling the particular texture of good masonry, and felt something in her chest ease slightly for the first time since Thomas's funeral. Here, at least, was something built with care, something that had once served a purpose larger than itself, and she understood in that moment, with the clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life around ovens, that this building had been someone's whole heart once, the way her mother's bakery had been her mother's whole heart, and the way this farmless, husbandless kitchen would now have to become hers. It was on her second day of cleaning that Eleanor found the first small clue tucked behind a loose brick in the oven's outer wall. Not the cellar door itself, which she had not yet worked up the courage to approach, but a small tin box, rusted at the seams, containing a single folded letter written in a careful, foreign-slanted hand, addressed to no one, dated the spring before Josiah Kestrel's death. The letter was written in Danish, a language Eleanor did not read, but tucked inside it was a second, smaller paper, this one in English, written perhaps by a neighbor Kestrel had asked to translate for him, and it read only, "For whoever finds this with an honest heart, what waits below was never mine to keep. It belongs to Millhaven Creek, all of it, every dollar, and every name in that book. I cannot give it back myself. Forgive an old man his cowardice, and finish what I could not." Eleanor sat on the bakery's dusty floor for a long while after reading those words, the tin box open in her lap, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman who has stumbled, quite by accident, onto the edge of something far larger than herself. She thought of Henrietta Bragg's warning on the courthouse steps, of the whole town's decade of superstitious avoidance, and she understood, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that whatever slept behind that cellar door was not a curse at all, but an unpaid debt. And Eleanor Whitfield, who had learned at her mother's elbow that a person's worth was measured by what they gave away, found she could not simply nail the door shut again and walk on. It took her 4 more days to gather the courage, and when she finally pried the boards free from the small door set into the floor beside the oven's foundation, the hinges shrieked with 9 years of rust, and a breath of cellar-cool air rose up to meet her, smelling of dry earth and old paper rather than anything so simple as flour. She descended a short ladder into a room no larger than a modest pantry, dug perhaps by Kestrel himself into the hard Kansas clay, and there, arranged with a precision that spoke of a man who had done this carefully and with great deliberation, she found what Josiah Kestrel had spent the last years of his life protecting. There were 4 wooden strong boxes, and inside them, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, lay coin and folded bills amounting to a sum Eleanor could scarcely make herself count the first time through. But more important than the money itself was the ledger she found beside the boxes, a thick, leather-bound book filled with Kestrel's careful accounting, names and dates, and amounts stretching back nearly 15 years. Eleanor understood, turning those pages by lantern light, that she was looking at the secret history of half the families in Millhaven Creek. Josiah Kestrel, it emerged from that ledger and from letters tucked between its pages, had not always been merely a baker. In his younger years in Millhaven Creek, before the town's bank had failed in the Panic of 1873, Kestrel had served as an informal keeper of savings for immigrant families and struggling farmers who did not trust the bank, or who the bank, in its prejudice, would not properly serve. Danish and Bohemian and Swedish settlers mostly, families with unfamiliar names and unfamiliar accents, who handed their hard-earned dollars to a fellow immigrant they trusted rather than risk them with bankers who looked at them sideways. When the bank failed in '73 and took half the town's visible savings down with it, Kestrel's quiet, informal vault beneath his bakery had been the only money in Millhaven Creek that survived intact, and rather than announce this fact and become a target for every desperate soul in the county, the frightened old baker had simply gone on baking bread, telling no one, waiting, the ledger suggested, for some safer moment to return the money that never quite seemed to come. Eleanor found, among the names in that ledger, the Kowalskis, the Ostranders, a dozen families she had baked bread for herself in better years, families still scraping by on farms mortgaged twice over to men like Cyrus Whitfield, never knowing that a fortune meant for them had been sleeping in the ground not half a mile from their own kitchens. And on the ledger's final pages, in Kestrel's own hand, dated only weeks before his death, was a name that made Eleanor's breath catch entirely. Cyrus Whitfield, who as a young bank clerk in Millhaven Creek before his rise to Topeka, had once come to Kestrel privately, the ledger recorded, demanding to know where the town's missing savings had gone after the '73 panic, and threatening the old baker with exposure to the authorities unless Kestrel handed the money to him instead, quietly, for his own use. Kestrel had refused, the ledger noted with what read like real fear, and it was shortly after this refusal that Kestrel began nailing shut doors and speaking to no one, a frightened old man protecting a secret from a young one already showing the shape of the man he would become. Eleanor Whitfield climbed back up out of that cellar as the sun was setting and sat a long while on her sagging porch, the ledger in her lap, understanding now, with terrible clarity, why Cyrus Whitfield had been so quick to seize her farm, so quick to produce papers with Thomas's signature that Thomas had never mentioned to his own wife. For it was Cyrus, she now suspected, who had somehow finally learned that Kestrel's vault might still exist, might still be findable, and who had wanted the Larkspur Bakery parcel cleared and sold quietly at that tax sale precisely so that he, and not some stranger, could buy it up and finish the search his younger self had begun and abandoned. That he had been $3 too slow, that he had perhaps not thought a broke and grieving widow would think to bid on a cursed and boarded ruin, was, Eleanor understood, the only reason any of this now sat in her hands rather than his. It did not take long for Cyrus Whitfield to learn what Eleanor had found, or at least to suspect it, for Nathaniel Ferris was not a discreet young man, and word traveled through Millhaven Creek the way water travels through a cracked jar, slowly at first, and then all at once. Cyrus arrived at the bakery on a Thursday afternoon in a hired buggy, dressed in the fine gray suit of a man who had done well for himself trading in other people's misfortune, and he did not bother with pleasantries. He informed Eleanor that whatever she had found on that property was, by every law he understood, the rightful property of whoever held title to the land at the time of discovery, which was to say himself, since he intended to purchase the bakery from her immediately, at a price he pronounced generous, $50 cash before nightfall. Eleanor, standing in her own doorway with the ledger hidden beneath a floorboard behind her, told him she had not decided whether she wished to sell at all, and Cyrus's practiced sorrow curdled, just slightly, into something colder. He reminded her, in a voice pitched low and pleasant for the benefit of any passerby, that a woman alone, with no proof of legitimate income and a suspicious reputation for having beggared herself buying a haunted ruin, could find herself the subject of a great deal of unwelcome county attention regarding vagrancy, or theft, or the improper concealment of found property that might rightfully belong to the county treasury. A threat wrapped so carefully in civility that Eleanor understood at once she was dealing with a man who had ruined people this way before, quietly, legally, without ever once raising his voice. Word of Cyrus's visit spread through Millhaven Creek faster than the news of the discovery itself, and for a difficult week Eleanor found herself the subject of the town's divided suspicion. Some, remembering Henrietta Bragg's warnings, whispered that the widow Whitfield had disturbed something cursed and would bring misfortune down on them all. Others, more practical, wondered aloud whether she meant to keep whatever fortune she'd found for herself, buying that bakery so cheap and so quick. After her farm troubles began to look, to unkind eyes, rather too convenient. Even Anna Kowalski, who had taken Eleanor in without question, grew quiet and careful around her, and Eleanor understood, with an ache that surprised her, how quickly a community's trust could curdle into suspicion when there was money and mystery both involved. It was Elias Bragg, the nervous county recorder, who finally came to her privately one evening, twisting his hat in his hands, and admitted that he had been the one to search Kestrel's old bank records at Cyrus's request some years back, that he had always suspected something was wrong in how Cyrus had come by so many mortgages so cheaply, and that he had been too frightened of losing his position to speak of it until now. If what's down there is really what I think it is, Bragg told her, then half this town is owed a debt 9 years overdue, and the other half deserves to know how Cyrus Whitfield really built his fortune. Eleanor asked him, quietly, whether he would be willing to say so before the county judge, and Bragg, pale but resolved, said that he would. Eleanor called a meeting at the bakery itself on the following Sunday afternoon, inviting every family named in Kestrel's ledger, and though several came only out of curiosity or suspicion, nearly 30 people crowded into the small room by the great cold oven to hear what she had to say. She did not speak first of the money. She spoke instead of Josiah Kestrel, the frightened, silent baker none of them had ever truly known, a man who had kept faith with immigrant families the town's own bank would not properly serve, who had protected their savings through a panic that ruined half the county, and who had died alone and afraid rather than surrender that trust to a man who threatened him. She read aloud, with Elias Bragg's help translating the portions still in Danish, the ledger's final entries naming Cyrus Whitfield's threats, and she watched 30 faces shift, in the space of that reading, from suspicion of herself towards something far graver directed at the man they had all, in their different ways, owed money to for years. She told them, plainly, that every dollar in those strong boxes belonged to the names written beside it in Kestrel's careful hand, the Kowalskis and the Ostranders and a dozen families besides, and that she wanted nothing from it for herself beyond the bakery and the oven she already owned outright. Cyrus Whitfield, informed too late that the meeting had happened at all, arrived at the county judge's office the following morning to find Elias Bragg already there ahead of him, ledger evidence in hand, along with 3 farmers whose mortgage papers, examined now with fresh and suspicious eyes, showed signatures and figures that did not match the men's own memories of what they had actually borrowed. The reckoning, when it came, was quieter than Eleanor might have expected and, in its own way, more complete. The county judge, shamed perhaps by his own too hasty foreclosure signature, ordered a full accounting of Cyrus Whitfield's mortgage dealings across the county, and within 2 months, under threat of prosecution for fraud, Cyrus was made to void the false debts he had manufactured against Thomas Whitfield's farm and restore its title to Eleanor free and clear, alongside a half-dozen other properties he had claimed through similarly shadowed papers. He left Millhaven Creek before the spring thaw, his Topeka fortune considerably diminished, and his name no longer welcome at any table in the county. And though Eleanor felt no triumph in his ruin, she felt something quieter and more durable, the sense of a scale tipped wrong for 9 long years, finally settling level again. With Kestrel's fortune returned to its rightful families, the Kowalskis paid off their own debts and helped Ferris buy new cattle to replace what the drought had taken. The Ostranders rebuilt their barn, and Eleanor, true to the promise she had made that Sunday afternoon, kept for herself only the bakery, the oven, and enough of Kestrel's coin to properly repair the sagging porch and buy flour enough to open, at last, for business. She restored her mother's sourdough starter to its proper vigor in a crockery bowl by the great brick oven. And on a bright morning in April of 1889, the Larkspur Bakery opened its doors for the first time in a decade, and the whole of Millhaven Creek came to taste the bread of the woman who had turned a cursed ruin into the very thing that saved them. We began this story by telling you that Eleanor Whitfield, at 47, cast out with almost nothing by the very brother of the husband she had buried, spent 9 of her last $11 on a boarded-up bakery no one else would touch, and that beneath its oven slept a promise time could not break. That promise was Josiah Kestrel's own, a frightened old man's quiet, costly faithfulness to families the world had been too careless to properly protect, sealed away for 9 years until a woman with nothing left to lose was brave enough and honest enough to open the door others had warned her never to touch. Eleanor Whitfield did not find a curse beneath that oven. She found the truth her mother had taught her at a Council Bluffs kitchen table decades before. That worth is not measured by what a person owns, but by what they are willing to hand back to others when they themselves have almost nothing left at all. In restoring Kestrel's forgotten fortune to the families who had earned it, Eleanor restored something else too, something the ledger could never have measured. The town's own faith that decency, however long buried, does not simply rot away in the dark. It waits. Thank you for spending this time with Eleanor Whitfield and the town of Millhaven Creek, and for letting her story sit with you a while. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding tonight that overlooked things are not always worthless things. Before you go, we would love to ask you this. Has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.